Hello and welcome to this week's lecture, which is on mother goddesses. Mother goddesses are considered to be, at least if we go by the archaeology, there seems to be one of the oldest forms of religious worship seems to be mother goddess worship. However, that said, there seems to be a lot of conclusions drawn about that worship that there's not a whole lot of evidence that they're accurate. Let's put it that way. I want to talk about that during this lecture, but I want to talk about the idea of the mother goddess in these various, we want to talk about it obviously in Greek and Roman culture, but I also want to talk about the whole idea of the mother, in the way that the mother goddess is perceived as an archetype, and also obviously from a psychological standpoint. So the way that I'm going to structure this class is first we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to review the model of consciousness that Jung puts forth. And there's an important reason for that, for going back over that first. Then we're going to look at ideas of the mother, associations with the mother, some of the oldest ideas of mother goddesses in civilization. And then look at how the psychology of that ends up playing out in the way that we see masculine and feminine roles in modern life. We will talk a little bit specifically about certain mother goddesses and mention, who they are and maybe a little bit about their cults and so forth. But the main focus here is going to be on the psychological aspect of really the mother archetype, because the mother goddess, whatever else the mother goddess may be, whether it be the physical earth itself, whether it be some other kind of image that we see either as nurturing or devouring, that image is archetypal by definition. In other words, it's something that's embedded in our consciousness. There's some idea of mother, whether or not that idea actually matches the biological mother that we have. So I'm going to read you a little bit from Carol Gilligan. And I'm also going to take a look not only at Jung's idea, particularly in Greek, with relation to, say, the relationship of Demeter and Kore, Demeter being the goddess of agriculture, Kore being her daughter, so that mother-daughter relationship. But also the whole idea of Earth mothers, what they do, and how the mother archetype can cause certain kinds of neurotic behavior. I think it's all connected to this notion. It may seem psychology heavy in this particular course or particular class, but there's a reason for it. It's because our ideas about the mother goddess and the great mother, the narrative that creates for us in our culture, or the way that has been perceived in our culture, has a huge impact on women, on women's roles. And it has a huge impact on the way that we tend to view the feminine in general, because the mother is where it starts from. Archetypally, there's the two main female archetypes are the mother and the anima. And the anima we talk about in love mythology. But and the anima is for the child, their first experience, whether they're male or female, is the archetype of the mother in some form. Whether that be their actual mother, whether it be somebody who acts as a mother to them, and then there's the case of when someone has a lack of that. There's different inflections and ways of looking at that. And then when one reaches an age towards puberty, the idea of the anima then becomes activated, because now they're at an age where there can be sexual feelings, and where the idea of this sort of idealized feminine image comes to bear. And as we noted in love mythology, often that means that once a couple is married, unfortunately, what frequently happens unconsciously is the anima projected onto the partner, again, assuming a male-female relationship. The female then goes back to being mother. So it's important to understand what that is. So I'm going to share my screen and go to my play. Okay. Okay. So let's start with the background. So first of all, we have, as I've mentioned, I have an Eric Neumann quote from one of my first lectures where I say, consciousness is often seen as masculine. It's associated with the sky. We think about the Greek creation myth, Uranus. I think actually I talked about this in creation myths. Yeah, it's Uranus. Uranus is the god of the sky, and was perceived by the Greeks as masculine. Sky is perceived more as feminine by the Egyptians because it's more the idea of new possibility. But here we're looking at consciousness. The way that it's been translated into Western culture, consciousness is most certainly masculine. Now, the unconscious, and particularly the collective unconscious, is seen to be feminine in nature. That's why the collective unconscious is often metaphorically represented as like a great ocean. And in that ocean, we have all the sea beasts and monsters and serpent monsters, which we've seen in spite of the phallic interpretation of a serpent that might make you think of the serpent as masculine. There's a tremendous amount of feminine energy behind the serpent because the serpent is the creator and the devourer. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about how the serpent fits into this too. But if you see the model here, there's your conscious mind. The ego is you. This is your identity, your thoughts. When you're looking out your eyeballs, this is who you think that you are. That's the ego consciousness, okay? And also just what you perceive in the outside world around you. That's your conscious mind. It's your thoughts. And people make the mistake of thinking that their mind is just, that's it, So if somebody talks to you about certain feelings, you may say, oh, I don't think that. But you may think that unconsciously. Unconsciously, we think a lot about ourselves. Even if we generally have what we think of as a good self-image, you will find that there's stuff buried. This is what Jung would have referred to as the shadow, the things that are weak or that we somehow repress or are ashamed of because we may have a negative association of some kind. Now, the sort of looking at this like consciousness, almost like an egg here, kind of the next layer, and he's showing it as being a layer down. It's like digging down. If we think about it in dream symbolism, when we're getting to that kind of content that's not obvious to us, we're going down into, it's like, in dreams, it's often portrayed as going down into a basement. You're going down into the different levels, or you're an archaeologist digging for those older strata. So the personal unconscious goes back, and that makes sense because the personal unconscious tends to represent what we think of as our past, our experiences, the traumas we might have had in childhood, or the really great experiences where you go to a place. Oh, I like going to the beach because it reminds me of, when I was, there with my family, and, you know what I mean? These kinds of memories that are both positive and negative in terms of how we subjectively feel about them. And the personal unconscious, those experiences do tend to inform the way that we may react to future people or situations. One of the very left brain things that we do is we take the past and we apply what they call a causality to it. We decide that if it happened this way before, it's going to happen this way again, because last time I went through this experience, I did A and B happened. Therefore, when I do A, B happens. That isn't necessarily true. However, that's a script that we follow throughout our entire life. And, I was talking with somebody the other day, and this does apply to the mother concept, the idea of birth, of being born. When you're born, it's a trauma. Coming out of body is a trauma, regardless of whether you go by C-section or the natural way. Coming out of the body is a trauma. And that's a trauma of separation that unconsciously we retain. So throughout our life, anytime there's a separation, it's seen as bad. If we have a relationship that ends, if somebody dies, if we feel unaccepted by a certain group of people, we feel separated, and we associate separation with things that are very negative. Separation doesn't have to be negative, okay? It can be very, very positive, and it can also be something that, and if you look at it from the Eastern point of view, and I talk about this in my religion class, the East does not focus on the idea of separation. They say, yes, we experience the world as separate, but that is an illusion, which they call Maya or Mahamaya. It's the idea that And we perceive everything as separate because that's the only way in which we could live in the world. If you perceived everything as unified, this would be a wholly different experience. What might be interesting is to look at the theories of, I believe it's David Hoffman. He's a neuroscientist, and the way that he talks about reality as being a kind of hologram. I was listening to some of his theoretical stuff, and it's interesting how much, I don't think this is his intention, but he does connect very much in with a lot of this theory. And the idea that what we perceive as reality, he said, it's more like looking at the interface on a computer. The interface helps you interact with programs, but if you actually looked at all the programming underneath, you'd become overwhelmed. So very similarly, there's this idea that we kind of have this interface that tells us this is the world, this is the experience, this is what we perceive. But this is why they say what you perceive is not always what's real. So not to digress too far into that. We have the personal unconscious, and then of course we've talked about the collective. And the collective is very important here because this is where archetypes come from. This is where the mother archetype, among others, would be coming from. And this is the collective consciousness of humanity. And you can be very aware of collective consciousness because there's a pressure that it exerts on you. You may have your own thoughts about something, but frequently when growing up, there's going to be tradition. There's going to be what we call conventional wisdom. Now, the collective is more than that, okay? But there are certain narratives that dominate in society about how things are. And when we have those narratives, they tend to relate back to this archetypal content. For example, we may equate some of the roles of women, and the fact that people get so angry if women don't have children, it's because there's that unconscious mother archetype that talks about this need for creation and nurturing and so forth, and that gets interpreted in that way. But it's being interpreted in an unconscious way. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's not really thinking through the question. Okay, that's when you bring something to your conscious rational mind and analyze it and take it apart. And there are certain things that, yes, are absolutely worth analysis. They need to be brought into consciousness in order for you to deal with them. Because if they're unconscious, you're just going to act automatically and you don't ever think about what you're doing. So, so I want to lay this out because it's very important when we talk about the mother. Okay, I'm going to talk a little about object relations theory too, which is very Freudian. And this also tends to be, now to him, the collective has to do with reliance on the parents, like on some kind of super couple. Jung takes the idea of collective way farther than Freud does. I mean, Freud doesn't even scratch the surface because to him, everything is about the parental relationship. And that really doesn't go far enough because as Jung pointed out, there are a set of archetypal parents that have really nothing, just like projecting the anima and animus onto your love partners. They're not really the anima animus. Similarly, your mother and father are not really the mother and father archetype. They may behave differently from the unconscious expectation of what that should be. So, but as we know, a lot of Freudian theory is definitely built on parental relationship. Witness the Oedipus complex, which we talk about in the class on Theban saga and incest. But for him, identity is built here by establishing separateness of objects. So when we come into that world of separation, when we talk about life and creation mythology, that recognizing our difference, that's the moment at which we actually gain our humanity and we start to become an individual. We have that separation from the parents. A short summary of how object relations works is that the infant is born and the infant does not see itself as distinct from its mother. The mother may nurse the child, different things. And then eventually at some point though, usually when the child can look in a mirror and recognize itself as something other than its parent, that's the beginning, that's the move away from the collective and towards the individual. And you see how in that case, mother represents the collective, right? Because mother is that thing you are glued onto, you're a part of, you're an appendage of, until you recognize yourself as not part of mother. And then you go through a process of growing up in which you really distance yourself from mother and father. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't love your parents or whatever, but or maybe you do, maybe you don't. But it has more to do with the idea that as we grow up, our ideas and our identity become distinct, even though we may have connections to our family and there may be similarities. The idea is that we want to evolve, well, maybe I don't like the word evolve, that we grow into something different, okay? That something, we're not just simply a carbon copy of our parents. I mean, we're always going to have some of our parents' traits in some fashion. I mean, that doesn't, you know, whether that's something we consciously want or not. And yeah, the parental influence is always going to be there throughout our life. Again, regardless of what the relationship is to the parents, even if it's an absence of relationship. Okay. But the object relations is this idea of growing into an individual with your own identities. So usually they say by the age of 7 or so, you've kind of developed as a person, you kind of, you know, the baseline has been set. And then as you grow older, you know, your life experiences, some of those initial things you identify with will stay, other things will change and go away. You know, ideas you grew up with, you may have different experiences and go, hey, that idea I grew up with is BS, now I'm going to throw it out. The teenage years are a typical example of this, because when you're a teen, the idea is that you are, you know, that's the time when kids are usually like, Mom, you know, like they roll their eyes and, you know, yeah, you sit over there, I don't want to be associated with you. That typical teen behavior, or you just sit there, you put your earbuds in and you just like, everybody leave me alone. That's very much part of that process of removing yourself, you know, establishing yourself as an individual where your ideas are important. Okay, and that's how you develop. And eventually the cycle goes around till eventually you are back to rejoining a community, ideally, when you get older, when you've established yourself, when you've learned, when you've gone through experiences and maybe built your own families, relationships, traumas, whatever it is, and then you turn around and now you have something to offer back to the community. As you know, you're an individual still, but you're also part of a collective again. So that's like a return to the feminine in theory. Now, before I go on to the next slide, I want to read something to you. And it's something that will be included in the course material, at least in some versions. This is Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice. Okay. And I'm reading from chapter 2, which is called Images of Relationship. Now you have to listen to this. This is critical. This is very important. She says, in 1914, in his essay on narcissism, Freud swallows his distaste at the thought of abandoning observation for barren theoretical controversy, and extends his map of the psychological domain. Tracing the development of the capacity to love, which he equates with maturity and psychic health, he locates its origins in the contrast between love for the mother and love for the self. But thus dividing the world of love into narcissism and quote unquote object relations, which is what we're talking about here, where you're not separate from the mother, he finds that while men's development becomes clear, women's becomes increasingly opaque. The problem arises because the contrast between mother and self yields two different images of relationships. Relying on the imagery of men's lives in charting the course of human growth, Freud is unable to trace in women the development of relationships, morality, and a clear sense of self. This difficulty in fitting the logic of his theory to women's experiences leads him to set women apart, marking their relationships, like their sexual life, as a dark continent for psychology. Okay, so again, you know, this is a problem with Freudian theory. This is why Freudian theory is too limited, because it really doesn't take the whole into account. It is only strictly looking at things from a very masculine point of view. So she says, the problem of interpretation that shadows the understanding of women's development arises from differences observed in their experience of relationships. To Freud, though living surrounded by women and otherwise seeing so much and so well, women's relationship seems increasingly mysterious, difficult to discern and hard to describe. While this mystery indicates how theory can blind observation, it also suggests that development in women is masked by a conception of human relationships. Since the imagery of relationships shapes the narrative of human development, the inclusion of women by changing that imagery implies a change in the entire account. So she gives, she says, this shift in creates interpreting women's development is elucidated by the moral judgment of two 11-year-old children. Now, these are two children undergoing a psychological test. A boy and a girl who see the same dilemma, two very different moral problems. While current theory brightly illumines the line and logic of the boy thought, it casts scant light on that of the girl. The choice of the girl, whose moral judgments elude existing categories, is meant to highlight the issue of interpretation rather than to exemplify sex differences per se. So, okay, let's move on to what the actual thing is. The two children were in the same sixth grade class at school and were participants in the Rights and Responsibilities study, designed to explore different conceptions of morality and self. The sample selected for this study was chosen to focus the variables of gender and age while maximizing the developmental potential by holding a constant at a high level the factors of intelligence, education, and social class that have been associated with moral development, at least as measured by existing scales. The two children in question, Amy and Jake, were bright and articulate, and at least in their 11-year-old aspiration, resisted easy categories of sex role stereotyping, since Amy aspired to become a scientist while Jake preferred English to math. Yet their moral judgment seems initially to confirm for familiar notions about differences between the sexes, suggesting that the edge girls have on moral development during the early school years gives way at puberty with the ascendance of formal logic and thought in boys. The dilemma these 11-year-olds were asked to resolve was one series desired by Kohlberg to measure moral development in adolescence by presenting a conflict between moral norms and exploring the logic of its resolution. In this particular dilemma, a man named Heinz considers whether or not to steal a drug he cannot afford in order to save the life of his wife. In the standard format of Kohlberg's interviewing procedure, the description of the dilemma itself, Heinz's predicament, or Heinz's dilemma, the wife's disease, the druggist's refusal to lower his price, is followed by the question, should Heinz steal the drug? The reasons for and against stealing are then explored through a series of questions that vary and extend the parameters of the dilemma in a way designed to reveal the underlying structure of moral thought. Jake at 11 is clear from the outset that Heinz should steal the drug. Constructing the dilemma as Kohlberg did as a conflict between values of property and life, he discerns the logical priority of life and uses that to justify his choice. And this is Jake's answer. For one thing, a human life is worth more than money. And if the druggist only makes $1,000, he's still going to live. But if Heinz doesn't steal the drug, his wife is going to die. So they just follow up with, well, why is life worth more than money? Because the druggist can get $1,000 later from rich people with cancer, but Heinz can't get his wife again. Why not? Because people are all different and you couldn't get Heinz's wife again. So in other words, Heinz just can't get another wife, Asked whether he should steal the drug if he does not love his wife, Jake replies that he should, saying only there's a difference between hating and killing. But also, if Heinz were caught, the judge would probably think it was the right thing to do. Asked about the fact that in stealing, Heinz would be breaking the law, he says, well, the laws have mistakes and you can't go writing up a law for everything that you can imagine. Thus, while taking the law into account and recognizes its function in maintaining social order, he also sees the law as man-made and therefore subject to error and change. Yet his judgment that Heinz should steal the drug, like his view of the law, having mistakes, rests on the assumption of agreement, a societal consensus of moral values that allows one to know and expect others to recognize the right thing to do. So it would be, okay, so I'm going to skip over some of this analysis. In contrast, Amy's response to the dilemma conveys a very different impression, an image of development stunted by a failure of logic, an inability to think for herself. Asked if Heinz should steal the drug, she replies in a way that seems evasive and unsure. Well, I don't think so. I think there might be other ways besides stealing it, like he could borrow the money or make a loan or something, but he really shouldn't steal the drug, but his wife shouldn't die either. Asked why he should not steal the drug, she considers neither property nor law, but rather the effect could have on the relationship between Heinz and his wife. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail and then his wife might get sicker again, so he couldn't get more of the drug and it might not be good. So he should really just talk it out and find some other way to make money. Seeing the dilemma not as a math problem with humans, but a narrative of relationships that extends over time, Amy envisions the wife's continued need for her husband and the husband's continuing concern from his wife, and seeks to respond to the druggist's need in a way that would sustain rather than sever that connection. Just as she ties the wife's survival to preservation of relationships, so she considers the value of the wife's life in context of relationships, saying it would be wrong to let her die because if she died, it hurts a lot of people and it hurts her. Since Amy's moral judgment is grounded in the belief that if somebody has something that would keep somebody alive, then it's not right to not give it to them. She considers the problem and the dilemma to arise not from the druggist's assertions of rights, but from his failure of response. And so they go through. So she says, instead, seeing a world of compromised relationships rather than of people standing alone. Okay, she sees it collectively, not individual. It's not about the individual and the individual's rights. What's good for the larger group? Okay, a world that coheres through human connection rather than through systems of rules. She finds the puzzle in the dilemma to lie in the failure of the druggist to respond to the wife. Saying it's not right for someone to die when their life could be saved, she assumes that if the druggist were to see the consequences of his refusal, he would realize he should just give it to the wife and have the husband pay back the money later. Thus, she considers the solution to the dilemma to lie in making the wife's condition more salient to the druggist, or that failing, appealing to others who are in a position to help. Okay. Okay, moving on. Although the frustration of the interview with Amy is apparent in the repetition of questions and its ultimate circularity, the problem is focused on the assessment of her response. When considered in light of Kohlberg's definition of stages and sequence of moral development, her moral judgment appears to be a full stage lower in maturity than that of the boy. Scored as a mixture of stages 2 and 3, her responses seem to reveal a feeling of powerlessness in the world, an inability to think systematically about the concepts of morality or law, a reluctance to challenge authority or examine the logic of received moral truths, a failure even to conceive of acting directly to save a life, or to consider that such an action, if taken, could possibly have an effect. As her reliance on relationships seems to reveal a continuing dependence and vulnerability, so her belief in communication as the mode through which to resolve moral dilemmas appears naive and cognitively immature. How do you like that? And you still see evidence of that today, of people who have certain ways of looking at things, and it's either this way or it's this way. This is what everybody knows is right. Rather than thinking about, what was it in Star Trek? Captain Kirk used to say, Mr. Spock, I want that third alternative. We want to look at what's different. What's another way to look at this situation? And rather than looking at her response as a way of, not just making this a black and white issue, either he steals it or his wife dies. This becomes her community focus, like, well, surely other people are willing to help. Surely you can reach out for help. And the fact that that's regarded as an immature or, and powerless response shows you, when we talk about patriarchy, there it is. This idea that that's an inferior way to do things. So, but why is it an inferior way? It recognizes the connection and the collective. So when I talk about the feminine as collective and the individual as masculine, that's a demonstration of what I mean. And certainly when we talk about the archetype of the mother, we are talking about that collective. So yeah. And Carol Gilligan studies, she says, that, and even in studies of children at play, and this particular study about the dilemma, development of girls is seen as abnormal with respect to the development of boys. Because a lot of this is based on Freudian theory, and Freud sees any kind of return to the mothering feminine as regressive, and his identity models are certainly built on that. Even his theories of religion, if you read Future of an Illusion and things like that by Freud, it's definitely built on the idea of, oh, you're just a grown-up who wants mommy and daddy again. Like that's his attitude towards religion, and that's not really what religion is about. But that Freudian model, and it's extremely narrow. In academia, we will frequently say, that the more reductive a model is, the more it's probably bad. You don't want to reduce everything to a couple of common denominators. It's not to say that there may not be certain factors, but there's always, even if you can kind of come to a core idea, there's always variables. And what Freudian theory, I don't think is actually borne out through experience. It's, I don't experience the world that way, therefore your way of experiencing it isn't right. So it's interesting. So let's talk about mythology here now and identity. Now there is a belief that some humans, now there's this does connect in with the psychology. It really connects in with the psychology. There's a belief among some myth historians that there was an age of matriarchy. You'll hear this a lot. I even hear it now when I walk around. This is one of the things Robert Graves promotes. Fraser had this idea, George Fraser, Jane Harrison, even Campbell to a certain degree may have bought into this idea. Um, and that there was an age of matriarchy. In other words, that the world started with the mother goddess. And, because you have all these statues of these female fertility figures, and we're going to look at, one of them that suggest mother goddesses. And there's some of these images that were found that they say, see, this was the great mother. And, to look at those images without documentation is kind of somewhat dubious, but nonetheless, that is an idea. And I mentioned Mary Daly, the feminist writer, who, and her and others, she talks about the idea of patriarchetypes, that original archetypes of the mother were supplanted by those of the father. I don't really agree with any of that. Even as somebody who considers herself a feminist, I don't think that that's how it worked, and I will explain why. But nonetheless, when you read mythology, you have to be careful when you read mythology texts that imply that this was what it was. Usually they say there's some Aryan invaders from Russia or something that came down and brought war and terrible things. And, the beautiful matriarchal system that we had was disrupted. And well, we'll talk about that. Here's one of the earliest images. This is known as the Venus of Willendorf, and it's which is found in Germany, in Willendorf. And it's dated to about the year 24,000 BCE. So you see where we have these ideas and the implication that this is a feminine figure. This looks like a very robust, round, perhaps even pregnant woman with, large breasts and the, full body that is suggestive of a mother type figure or someone about to be a mother. So finding figures like this throughout Europe and to that ancient date tends to make people think that these are religious symbols. Now, any archaeologist will tell you that that isn't necessarily what they are, but we don't have a better theory at this point. That said, there's been a lot that's been deduced from the findings of these kinds of figures that may or may not be accurate. The attributes that we see of the Great Mother, okay, so she's a creatrix, okay? The Earth Mother either physically is the Earth in the case of Gaia, or creates the Earth. In some cases, she creates herself. But nonetheless, the idea, and then there's the whole idea of what they call the Gaia hypothesis. This was popular in the 80s. It was James, what's his last name? James with an H, I think. In any case, there's a whole book called the Gaia hypothesis, where the idea that the Earth itself is a living organism, okay? And that it needs to be treated as such, that the growth and so forth is part of, a living, breathing Earth. And thus, but in most mythologies, you see not only the Great Mother as creating life, but also as sustaining it. That said, the Earth Mother is also connected with the chthonic realm. Chthonic is a Greek word, chthonios. My podcast is called Chthoniya because it deals specifically with the underworld and the feminine. But it has to do, chthonic can have to literally do with chthon, with the earth, but, with the material world itself, but it also has to do with what lies underneath. More often, chthonic is referred to as the gods or deities or places that are under the earth in mythology, which we talk about in the underworld mythology class. But the Great Mother is also, because whatever's in the underworld, presumably if it's underground, that's also associated with her. Great Mother is associated with sexuality, fertility/sexuality. And it's probably better to differentiate those two because we tend to assume that fertility equals sexuality. Obviously, there has to be some kind of sexual activity, whatever that is in humans, animals, plants, for new things to be produced, whatever that is. But not everybody has sex for fertility reasons. So that's why I said there's a distinction, but nonetheless, sex is associated with that creative process. And of course, because you're associated with life, you're associated with death. From dust you came, into dust you shall return. When you're dead, your body is interred in the ground in some form, whether you're cremated, the ashes are spread somewhere, or you're or you're buried in a box under the earth. That's the so the Great Mother is also, because the Great Mother represents the life, the material life that we know in the space of time. You experience death. And she's associated with monsters, not only the serpent, but the dragon, various sea creatures, whales. The Great Mother tends to be associated with these, formidable, I guess you could say, manifestations of, of monstrous, this kind of monstrous power, again, is associated with the earth and the power of the force of the earth and its elements. Okay. The names that we see in the Greek, obviously, we have Gaia or Gi. You see it both ways. Rhea and Demeter are also versions of the great Earth Mother, at least for their fertility roles in terms of agriculture. Rhea is the mother of all the Olympian gods, or half of them. And then Demeter is, who is a daughter of Rhea, is the Olympian who is an agriculture goddess, and is the one who makes the plants grow for the earth. So they're all Earth mothers. In Rome, they're called Terra Mater, Earth Mother, literally. Ceres, which is another name, or Ceres, which is another name for Demeter, which is where, like I said, we get our word cereal from the grain. And Venus is also considered to be an Earth Mother, a great mother. She's the mother of the Roman people. So she takes on, even though she is a love goddess, she takes on that attribute. So that's where we see the sexuality connection in there too. The Sumerian and Hebrew, and I say Hebrew because originally there was a mother goddess in Hebrew religion called Astarte. It was Astarte or Asherah, same god, very similar to Inanna in Babylon. But Inanna, of course, is not so much a mother goddess as she is a goddess of sex and war. But her husband is in fact the god of agriculture. So the agricultural god is considered masculine there. She has more to do with the sexual force. And yes, because there used to be things, you read about them, the Bible actually mentions them at some point, probably, again, I can never remember if it's Leviticus or Deuteronomy, but you will no longer use Asherah poles, and these are probably poles that were used in certain fertility rites to the goddess Asherah. So it was the idea of, we're going now that we worship Yahweh, we're stopping all that. So it is mentioned. Cybele, we talked about her in the love mythology class and her relationship to Attis. And Cybele, to me, well, let me move on to that later. I was going to say that she represents an important aspect to me about this mythology of the matriarchy, the idea that, oh, it was all sweet and loving and nice. And the cult of Cybele, just like the cult of Ma, as you're going to see at the bottom, Cappadocian Ma. And I mentioned Ma specifically because Orestes, who is the son of Agamemnon in the tragedy is called the Oresteia, and we are going to talk about that when we talk about the Mycenaean saga. That is the one where Orestes, his mother Clytemnestra, when Agamemnon returns from the Trojan War, his mother kills his father. She's angry because he sacrificed her daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds. So she and his half-brother Aegistheus take over Mycenae, and Orestes has to avenge his father. But if he avenges his father, then he will be attacked by the Furies for killing his mother. So Orestes is in a bad place. But the idea is, and perhaps as a result of his, maybe to make atonement for killing his mother, supposedly they say Orestes goes to Cappadocia in Anatolia and cuts his hair to show the end of his affair, and then ends up founding the great mother rites there, which are the rites of Ma, literally just called Ma, sometimes with a circumflex over the A, but I've seen it both ways. The Cappadocian Ma. And that's specifically mentioned because in Rome, you will see references to that cult, which is connected to the cult of Cybele. Again, they're both Anatolian, so that makes sense, right? But that's the Greek understanding of how that, in other words, the Greeks set up that mother goddess temple in Cappadocia. So it's, but again, the rites of the goddesses themselves, I won't say in the Greek and Roman per se, I don't know that, there were probably specific festivals celebrating the earth, but certainly the Anatolian celebrations, they're the cults of Cybele, the cult of Ma, they are very violent. Generally, they regard not only perhaps animal, but sometimes human sacrifice, and they also involve castration. So they're not, so the idea that we had this sweet, the matriarchies were not sweet. Okay, the evidence that we have about their activities suggests that they were not these sweet. I mean, people were like, mad with ecstasy. They were in, you know, uh, people, orgies, like frenzied, things, but there was a lot of, they were somewhat gory. I mean, it's not a, you see some of these movies like Midsummer and things like that. And, yeah, they're meant to be folk horror movies, but it's not the folk horror. That folk horror motif is not far off from, it's based on something that we seem to have evidence did exist that way. And I don't believe that's the patriarchy putting in a negative interpretation. I mean, that's just what I think it was. And it's because, and we'll talk about that when I read from Jung, what this Earth Mother association is that brings that side of it, that bloody side of it out. Okay, just the myth theory on the mother, mainly Fraser and Harrison, again, who a little dubious, but nonetheless, they tended to put Paleolithic goddesses, Paleolithic being the really, really, like that Venus of Willendorf, the really ancient mothers, into certain categories based on the archaeology. And so they talk about actual Earth mothers. They talk about water goddesses, mother goddesses associated with water. The snake and bird variety of mother goddess or connected with that. And then also the ones who are death goddesses are also considered to be mothers in some form. Because again, you're in the collective womb of the mother, you return to that collective womb of the earth when you die. So there's definitely that cyclical connection. And it says the type, again, would depend on the symbolism that was seen on the statue. Whether they're accurate or not, don't know. Here's one example. This is from a signet ring, like a wax seal. They show this, what appears to be this woman in kind of a spirally kind of a dress with a rod, and she's got two lions, and she seems to be standing on some kind of a mountain. And there's somebody in front of her who we're not sure if that person is meant to be a worshiper, whether that's meant to be a partner, we don't know. And then there's this other image on the left that they often refer to as the horns of consecration. They say that those represent bull horns in some fashion because bulls were associated with fertility. So they see this as like a mother goddess kind of fertility image. And there's a motif of, what is it? The queen and two kings. In this case, we just see the queen and two lions. It's a repeated motif in the artwork. Again, we're not entirely sure because we don't have the writings. I mean, the Minoan writings are linear A and linear B texts, and we can only read linear B, and linear B is just lists of temple offerings. I mean, it's not really, it's like your grocery list for the temple. I mean, it's not, there's really nothing in there that tells us the particular story. And a lot of these stories were just made up by these people. So we could they be right? I mean, yeah, but they also could be wrong. We just don't necessarily have the evidence. And here's one example of those ancient images that that would be interpreted. She would be interpreted as some kind of an earth mother or a mountain mother of some kind. In the Common Era, now Common Era, I just mean CE as opposed to BCE, meaning supposedly after the birth of Christ is what we call the Common Era. Like right now we're in the year 2021 CE, Common Era. So mother figures that we have seen, on the left I have Isis, whom I talked about also, and there's with her son Horus. That's a very, and she's got the cow horns on her head. And of course, cows are also associated with motherhood and fertility in ancient Egypt. And the sun disk, and she's got, actually that's a combination one. She's got the horns and she's got the throne on the top of her head. And she's, and the sun disk there, again, there's this idea of abundance of life, of creation. And Horus, of course, is the child of Osiris, who was supplanted by his brother Set, who's considered to be the villain in this thing. Although Seth also has his, Seth is another one who's complicated. You can't just write him off as 100% of a bad guy. Even Isis doesn't write him off because she feels bad for him, which her son gets very mad about. But there's the idea that a Seth or Typhon is not entirely, you have to dive deep into the subject of Set. It's very complicated. Like a lot of these gods, we're not talking about unilaterally good and evil figures. But so there's the image there. If we have the mother sitting on the throne, and then on the right, we have the Madonna and child. I actually had somebody ask me one semester, what's a Madonna? Like people think of like the singer Madonna. And I'm like, no, Madonna is the word for the Blessed Mother, the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary. And so you see her with her son sitting on her lap on a throne. And and it's not a coincidence that that's modeled on the Isis version. Certainly because when Christianity was a thing in the beginning of the Common Era, the Egyptian cults were very, very popular as well. The cult of Isis was very popular. Plutarch writes a lot about this. And so that was popular along with the Ma cult and along with the Kibali cult and the cult of Mithras. Those were all very, very popular along with the usual run of Roman gods, which were based a lot on the Greek gods, was all happening in Rome right around that time, which would have been, at the end of the BC and moving into the Common Era. We've tended to redo our calendar in terms of Christianity, but Christianity was not the only nor the dominant religion at that time. It just became, once the emperors adopted it, then that's when it became the dominant religion throughout Europe and so forth. So, but these images do inform each other, and they are meant to show this idea of the, this kind of idea of the ideal of the mother and the child. And in this case, we're talking about the child as kind of a divine potential. And I'm going to talk more about that in the Divine Child lecture. Okay, I want to talk about Erich Neumann, and I'll give you the excerpt from this. This is from his book entitled The Great Mother. And he refers to the Great Mother as the Great Round, or the Ouroboros. And I'll show you the image of the Ouroboros coming up. And Ouroboros is a snake swallowing its tail. So basically the circular image, Jung associates the circular image with the archetype of the self. Okay, self is like the God archetype. And it represents for him that kind of Gnostic idea of the divine within humans, okay, or even the Orphic idea, that we have a divine spark. But here, this is the idea of the round, because when we see the woman, like you saw that Willendorf figure, there's a lot of round figures, curved figures. So that curved figure is associated with the mother goddess. Okay, so she is the great round. Okay, and she's kind of a vessel. Again, if you think about the idea of a womb that births all of this stuff, and then of course at the end of the seasons it dies and it all goes back and then it comes out again, right? Which is the Ouroboros thing. It's a continuous loop. So she's described often as a vessel or a container, and some vessels are closed and others, like a grail or a chalice, are open. And an open vessel often represents, or even the idea of the feminine as a void of some kind, represents possibility. What hasn't been formed yet, but what is forming, okay? And what can be brought to creation. But definitely the chalice or the cup is associated with the mother, with the Great Mother. And thus you can see why water, or why, like the liquid, would be associated also with, because it has to do with the emotions, going with the flow rather than reasoning everything out. And the idea of the round too can suggest community. It suggests something collective. It's not just about, you or me or what I want. It's about everybody, okay? So, but what's happened over time, and we definitely see this, particularly, and I don't mean to get into economic theory here, but capitalism, it's just a fact. It's highly individualistic. It's highly about being self-made, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, make it, you've just got to, buckle down and work hard and build character. And that's very capitalistic. Although ironically, all of the first capitalists were speculators, kind of like people now who play the stock market, and didn't work at all. But putting that aside, the idea, nonetheless, this rugged individual idea, and it's interesting how many of those guys are survivalists or outdoorsmen or things like that. People who are really, really super into it. Because there's actually, ironically, an implied devaluing of the earth there, because there's as we saw in the Carol Gilligan piece, there's a devaluing of the collective. And so, and it starts with Plato. It starts with the Greek philosophers, really, not just Plato, but Plato's kind of I don't want to say he's the apex of it, but he's probably the most, full form of it, that because later on we have Aristotle, and then we have Neoplatonism and Neoplatonism, and that still affects our thinking to this day. And so it's the idea that the material world, and even the Gnostics, there's the idea that the material world somehow is bad. And as I mentioned in creation mythology, there's that biblical view of the world as corrupt and needing to be fixed because it contains death, and death must be overcome. Okay, that's usually the thing that's imperfect about it. Like, oh, we could have just lived forever. And I'm like, well, how boring would that be? But to me, that's not really the definition of life. Is to live forever and ever. That's not the definition. I mean, what happens after, that's a separate question, probably a separate course, but that is, but nonetheless, the material world, we talk about rejecting the material world, or, certain things, money is the root of all evil. Well, money is the root of all evil in an individualistic society, yes, where it's all about you. But the idea, because the earth is the place of abundance, the name Pluto, which is one of the names of the god of the underworld in Roman, and Pluto's the name, was the name of the now non-planet that was a planet. Pluto comes from Pluton, at least one of it, Plusos or Pluton, which has to do with what's under the earth. I mean, think about it. Where do you get gold? Where do you get gems? Where do you get diamonds? They're mined from the earth. So the earth is the source of abundance and riches, the things that we consider to be valuable, in addition to food and things that helps us to live. So, but we devalue that, or we think we're better than it, or in charge of it, or because we have reason, we're smarter than it. This is why we're in the kind of climate change crisis that we're in right now, because we think we're better than it. Ultimately, people say to me, oh, the whole earth is going to be destroyed. And I'm like, nah, earth won't be destroyed. We'll be destroyed. The earth won't be destroyed. It'll just get rid of those toxic things, and it'll just, it'll wipe us out, and it'll just move on, and it'll breed some other kind of being, maybe other human, I don't know, But we have this idea of pure spirit. That's why even in magical practice, okay, they talk about, when people try to talk about white magic versus black magic, which is pretty funny, because there's really no difference. It's this idea of what's the focus. If your focus is on angelic beings and spiritual knowledge, that's one thing. But if you're like, cursing your neighbor, or, trying to make more money for yourself, or something material in nature, something doesn't have an elevated spiritual purpose, oh, well, that's getting more into the demonic stuff. And I'm like, yeah, there's really actually no difference between angels and demons. If you want to know about that, I have in my Scholars of the Borderland, there is an underworld mythology class that takes a look at that. That's actually a rabbit hole you can go down for years, but the angelic and the demonic are definitely based on ancient astrological correspondence with the decans, and with, like the Egyptian idea of the decans and the lunar mansions. It's not something that, and they have the same origin. They're not, and the idea of the daemon comes from, it comes from Greek. It's the idea of a spirit that mediates between humans and gods. It's become something else, like one's evil and one's good. And, the reality is, for people who do deal in those kinds of things, that there's really not, it's mainly in the personalities, is it like, is there personality? I mean, personality could be dangerous on either side, to be honest. Angelic personalities can also be dangerous, but I don't want to sidetrack into that. Nonetheless, there's this idea that what's celestial is what's to be aspired to, and what's of the earth, because it dies and because it goes away. Therefore, it's inferior and it's devalued. And that's the reason we're all miserable in life, because we don't actually enjoy the life that's here. But there's the Ouroboros. There's the serpent. In this case, it's a dragon swallowing its own tail. You just see it as regular snake swallowing its tail as well. But that is the image that is shown. And so this is the idea, and this is, again, the serpent as a representation of life, and this may represent the cycles potentially of nature, and potentially of reincarnation, if you believe in something like that, the idea that we're born over and over, we die and are born over and over again. But also just this idea that life begets death, life devours itself, okay? Life is a self-devouring thing, and that can be terrifying if we really contemplate that. Which is why it's important to live in the present and think about what you have now, which most of us are really bad at doing, myself included. But it eventually, that's the idea, is that, you can get very hung up on morbidity, on trying to stave off death. We're obsessed with it in this culture to a point that we probably bring it on faster. But Yeah, but there's that idea, that's that feminine association. And of course the serpent, we've seen Tiamat, we've seen these, I talk about creation myths and their monsters. I have that chart that I had for you. The reason I point that out is because this great mother, this maternal instinct, has that kind of serpentine or monster quality, but not in the sense of being evil, and just representing that mystery. And of course, snakes shed their skin, they molt. Their skin, and so it looks like you have another little perfect snake that's been left behind, and they go on. So it looks like there's the dead snake and there's the reborn one. So that's where they kind of get this motif. And and it connects with the sun and the moon too. The sun rises during the day and it goes away. It's dark now, sun went away. Sun's dead, now he's back to life again in the morning. Moon, same thing. It waxes full, then it's full. Oh, and now it's going waning. Oh, now it's gone away. Oh, look, now it's back again. All of these things have to do with this idea of this regeneration. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the myth of the matriarchy for a moment. Arthur Evans was a very rich man who basically bought the city of Knossos on the island of Crete. And he dug up a lot of Minoan Cretan artifacts. He's probably the one who found the tablets and everything. Arthur Evans did a lot with the archaeology, but kind of like Heinrich Schliemann, who was the guy who excavated the original site of Troy and got a lot of it wrong and made a lot of mistakes, which destroyed a lot of stuff permanently. And I guess you got to give these guys credit for being the first to try and to bring things to light that we now can study. So, kudos to them for that. But he tended to believe in that idea of a peaceful matriarchy. And then there's the mythology there, that there was once matriarchal and peaceful, and then white male warrior invaders took over and made us a patriarchy. The facticity of this has pretty much been debunked. A really good book on this is called The Myth of the Matriarchy, Why Creating an Invented Past Doesn't Give Us a Future, by Cynthia Eller, who, by the way, was a Montclair State professor. Now she's, she was also the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. I think she's potentially working on another book, I think, but she was, but Cynthia was somebody who, she goes through it pretty thoroughly. Now, there's some people who disagree with her theoretical stuff too. A lot of people don't like the way she disses Maria de Lutas and some of the others. But again, what her point is that a lot of this stuff that the interpretations laid forth, yes, those could be the right interpretations, or they might not. It's all speculation. We don't have any actual evidence. So, and for me, the myth of the matriarchy is not, it's psychological. It represents that psychological, what's happened in Western culture. It's actually a good characterization of what we think of in object relations theory, where you have, you start with the mother, you are part of the mother, and then when reason and all these things that make you an individual come flooding in, and it is like a crisis when they come flooding in, as you continually psychologically change, that's traumatic. That's traumatic, if in the hero myths, when you have the idea of the hero living an idyllic pastoral life, and then a crisis occurs, and now he's got to respond to it, because now he has to become an individual, he has to become the hero. And we're going to talk about that in the later part of this course. But yeah, the idea that someone has to become the hero, that's a very masculine Western narrative. And we still follow it. We still follow it. You still have this idea that, boys being told, you've got to grow up and become men and do this and take over this and run that. I mean, women fall into that too. Women also have to do the same thing. And there's nothing wrong with growing up, becoming an individual and doing your thing. But those mythologies, which we tend to forget today, eventually go back to, okay, now I have gone through my trials, and now I have a treasure to bring back to the community. That piece doesn't always happen. And it's not the piece that's promoted now in literature and culture. It's more like, yay, I'm victorious and screw all the rest of you. And that's not really, that's a problem. That individualism taken to an extreme can be a problem. I think the COVID, what we've gone through with COVID has been a remarkable way of nature putting that narrative right in front of our face. Because the people who are saying, like, I'm not getting vaccinated, I have a choice, I don't need to wear a mask, I have a choice, because I personally don't want to. Now, to be fair, that's not black and white either. There's people who maybe for medical reasons don't feel like they can be vaccinated, or their doctors have told them not to. But there's also a lot of false things. I've heard people tell me things like, oh, someone got vaccinated and had a heart attack the next day. Probably a coincidence. It's not about, it's the way in which we, that individualism, having to go out wearing a mask restricts my freedom. It's like, yes, but are you thinking about the collective? Are you thinking about the old person you encounter? Like if you personally get COVID, maybe you don't care, but how does that affect the community around you? To me, regardless of where you fall on any of that, that is definitely starkly illustrated the tension between the individual and the community. Okay, that's definitely there. Okay, the next thing I want to do, just want to read two pieces really quick. The first one I want to read is from Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung, and the piece is called The Psychological Aspects of the Chore. Now, Chore, again, is another name for Persephone, and that means young girl in ancient Greek. That's in Greek, the word Chore means girl. And so he talks about the relationship between Demeter and Persephone, or Chore. And I just want to read a few bits of it that are relevant to what we're talking about here. So Jung says, this figure corresponding to Chore in a woman is generally a double one, a mother and a maiden, which is to say that she appears now as one and now as the other. From this, I would conclude for a start that in the formation of the Demeter-Chore myth, the feminine influence so far outweighed the masculine that the latter had practically no significance. The man's role in the Demeter's myth is really only that of seducer or conqueror. As a matter of practical observation, the Chore appears as a woman in a woman as an unknown young girl, not infrequently as Gretchen, which is from Faust's Goethe's, Dr. Faustus, or the unmarried mother. Another frequent modulation is the dancer, who is often formed by borrowing from classical knowledge, in which case the maiden appears as the Corybant, which is a follower of Cybele, a Maenad, who's a follower of Dionysus, or a nymph, as we know, is a kind of a water spirit. An occasional variant is the Nixie or water sprite, who betrays her superhuman nature by her fishtail. Sometimes the Chore and mother figures slither down altogether to the animal kingdom, the favorite representatives that being the cat, the snake, or the bear, some other black monster of the underworld like the crocodile, or a salamander-like saurian creature. The maiden's helplessness exposes her to all kinds of dangers, for instance, being devoured by reptiles or ritually slaughtered like a beast of sacrifice. Often there are bloody, cruel, and even obscene orgies to which the innocent child falls victim. Sometimes it's a true Nikia, which is an underworld journey, a descent into Hades, and a quest for the treasure hard to attain, occasionally connected with orgiastic sexual rites or offerings of menstrual blood to the moon. Oddly enough, the various tortures and obscenities are carried out by an Earth Mother. They are drinkings in blood, bathings in blood, crucifixions. The maiden who crops up in case histories differs not inconsiderably from the vaguely flower-like Chore, and that the modern figure is more sharply delineated and not so unconscious. Figures corresponding to Demeter and Hecate are superordinate to, say, over life-size mothers, ranging from the Pieta type, which is the mother, Mary looking at Jesus on the cross, to the Balbo type, which is Balbo's a very woman who tries to make Demeter laugh by showing her basically her sexual organs while she's lamenting the loss of her daughter. He says, I can only recall a very few cases where Demeter's own noble figure in its pure form breaks through as an image rising spontaneously from the unconscious. He says, I remember a case where a maiden goddess appears clad in purest white, carrying a black monkey in her arms. The Earth Mother is always chthonic, occasionally related to the moon, either through blood sacrifice mentioned or child sacrifice, or else because she's adorned with a sickle moon, sickle being like the thing you use to cut. In pictorial or plastic representations, mother is a dark, deepening black to red, with a primitive or animal expression of face. In form, she not infrequently resembles the Neolithic idea of the Venus, okay? And then there's ones with multiple breasts, like those of a sow or pig. The Earth Mother plays an important part in the woman's unconscious. All her manifestations are described as powerful. This shows that in such cases, the Earth Mother element in the conscious mind is abnormally weak and requires strengthening. So he talks about, the maiden often described not altogether human in the usual sense. She's either of unknown or peculiar origin, looks strange, or undergoes strange experiences. from which one is forced to infer the maiden's extraordinary myth-like nature. Equally and more strikingly, Earth Mother is a divine being in the classical sense. Moreover, she does not always appear in the guise of a Baobo, but for instance, more like Queen Venus in this, I'm not going to say that, though she is invariably heavy with destiny. The other unaesthetic forms of the Earth Mother are in keeping with a prejudice of the modern feminine unconscious. This prejudice was lacking in antiquity. The underworld nature of Hecate, closely connected to Demeter, and Persephone's fate point nevertheless to the dark side of the human psyche, though not to the same extent as the modern material. So he, okay, so he's talking about this in men's consciousness. And the way that this relates back to the archetype of the self, which I don't want to get into here so much. Okay, this is the last piece. Demeter and Kore, mother and daughter, extend the feminine consciousness upward and downward. They add an older and younger, stronger and weaker dimension, and widen out the narrow, limited conscious mind bound in space and time, giving it intimations of a greater and more comprehensive personality, which has a share in the eternal course of things. In other words, it connects to the collective, which is outside of time. That's another element of the collective unconscious. It has nothing to do with time. It's outside of time. We can hardly suppose that myth and mystery were invented for any conscious purpose. It's more likely that they are the involuntary reaction of a psychic but unconscious precondition. Yes, it's not something that we can wrap our minds around. The psyche pre-existent to consciousness, like that in the child's, participates in the maternal psyche on one hand, while on the other it reaches across to the daughter psyche. We could therefore say that every mother contains her daughter in herself, and every daughter her mother. Every woman extends backwards into her mother and forwards into her daughter. Okay, so that's also the idea of this feminine as being mother and daughter. You never, no matter how you feel about your own mother, you never quite get rid of that. I mean, that there's always that element there, whether it's something you consider as a positive and nurturing element or not, because you can't always assume someone's biological mother is always nurturing. It doesn't always happen. Okay, but that does lead me to this very last piece from Jung's writing on the mother complex. I just want to share three things from this, three short things about the mother complex of the daughter, being we're talking about how mother and daughter extend into each other. And again, this is where I feel that this matriarchy myth is. I mean, because eventually that collective sense, that connection to the mother, gets developed into this idea of being an individual, and we get away from the idea of, we reject that until, potentially we reach a time where that can be reintegrated. But in this story, it's just lamenting that rejection. But it's a rejection that has to happen, whether it has to happen in that way or not, because we do all become individuals. But therefore the conclusions that we tend to draw about motherhood and about everything else tend to be very negative as a result, and that's the problem. Okay, he talks about, I think it's three different types of mother-daughter complex. So this is an erotic complex. Okay, these are problems that arise. Hypertrophy of the maternal element. We've noted that the daughter and the mother complex leads to either a hypertrophy or to its atrophy. The exaggeration of the feminine side means an intensification of all female instincts above the maternal instinct. The negative aspect is seen in the woman whose only goal is childbirth. To her, the husband is of secondary importance. He is first and foremost the instrument of procreation. She regards him merely as an object to be looked after, along with children, poor relations, cats, dogs, and household furniture. Even her own personality is of secondary importance. She often remains entirely unconscious of it, for her life is lived in and through others. More or less complete identification with all the objects in her care. First, she gives birth to the children, and from then on, she clings to them, for without them, she has no existence whatsoever. Like Demeter, she compels the gods by her stubborn persistence to grant her the right of possession over her daughter. Her eros develops exclusively as a maternal relationship while remaining unconscious as a personal one, and unconscious eros always expresses itself as a will to power. Women of this type continue to live for others, a matter of fact, really unable to make any real sacrifice. Driven by ruthless will to power and a fanatical insistence on their maternal rights, they succeed in annihilating not only their own personality, but the personal lives of their children. Okay. So then the next type is the overdevelopment of eros. It by no means follows that the complex induced in a daughter by such a mother necessarily result from a hypertrophy of the maternal instinct. On the contrary, it may be wiped out altogether. As a substitute, an overdeveloped eros results, and this almost invariably leads to an unconscious incestuous relationship with the father. Okay, that's getting very Freudian, right? But the intensified eros, I think when she's saying father, it's not necessarily wanting to have incest with your father, more of like the father archetype gains more of an importance. The intensified eros places an abnormal emphasis on the personality of others. Jealousy of the mother and desire to outdo her become the leitmotifs of undertakings, which are often disastrous. A woman of this type likes romantic and sensational episodes for their own sake, interested in married men, less for themselves from the fact that they are married, and give her an opportunity to wreck a marriage, that being the whole point of her maneuver. Once the goal is attained, the interest evaporates for any lack of maternal instinct, and it'll be likely someone else's turn. And this type is noted for remarkable unconsciousness. Women really seem to be utterly blind to what they're doing, which is anything but advantageous either themselves or their victims. I need hardly point out that for men with a passive eros, this type offers an excellent hook for anima projections. So this woman who is unattainable is an excellent hook for men who want to project their anima. So this person may end up being kind of a fantasy woman, but she never really hooks into actual relationship. So on the one hand, you have the woman who, the daughter who, wants to have children and lives for nothing else. And then you have the woman who has no interest in children, but just lives to have sex. And then we have the third type, actually, there are four types. Sorry, I said three. Sounds like the Spanish Inquisition. 3, 4. Identity with the mother. If a mother complex in a woman does not produce an overdeveloped eros, it leads to identification with the mother and paralysis of the daughter's feminine initiative. A complete projection of her personality onto the mother then takes place, owing to the fact that she's unconscious of her maternal instinct and of her own eros being sex drive, love. Everything reminds her of motherhood. Responsibility, personal relationships, and erotic demands arouses feelings of inferiority and compels her to run away to her mother naturally, who lives to perfection everything that seems unattainable to her daughter. As a sort of superwoman, admired involuntarily by the daughter, the mother lives out for her beforehand all the girl might have lived for herself. She is content to cling to her mother in selfless devotion, while at the same time unconsciously striving almost against her will to tyrannize over her, naturally under the mask of loyalty and devotion. The daughter leads a shadow existence, visibly sucked dry by her mother, and she prolongs her mother's life in a sort of continuous blood transfusion. These bloodless maidens are by no means immune to marriage. The daughter leads a shadow existence. On the contrary, despite their shadowness and passivity, they command a high price on the marriage market. They are so empty that a man is free to impute to them anything that he fancies. In addition, they are so unconscious that the unconscious puts out countless invisible feelers, veritable octopus tentacles that suck up all masculine projections. And this pleases men enormously. All that feminine indefiniteness is a longed-for counterpart of male decisiveness and single-mindedness, which can be satisfactorily achieved only if a man can get rid of everything doubtful, ambiguous, vague, and muddled by projecting it onto some charming example of feminine innocence. Because of the woman's characteristic passivity, feelings of inferiority, which make her continually play the injured innocent, the man finds himself cast in an attractive role. He has the privilege of putting up with the familiar feminine foibles with real superiority, and yet with forbearance like a true knight. Fortunately, he remains ignorant of the facts that these deficiencies consist largely of his own projection. The girl's notorious helplessness is a special attraction. Yeah, some people always tell me, women want to feel needed. And I'm like, yeah, this is kind of an extreme version of that. And it says the woman is so much of an appendage of her mother, she can only flutter confusedly when a man approaches. She doesn't know a thing. Okay. And then the last type, the resistance to the mother. This is probably me. These three extreme types are linked together by many intermediate stages, of which I shall mention only one important example. In this particular intermediate type I have in mind, the problem is less an overdevelopment of an inhibition of the feminine instinct than an overwhelming resistance to maternal supremacy, often to the exclusion of all else. It is a supremacy example of the negative mother complex. The motto of this type, anything as long as it's not mother. On one hand, we have a fascination which reaches the point of identification. On the other, an intensification of eros, which exhausts itself in jealous resistance. This kind of daughter knows what she does not want, but is usually completely at sea to what she would choose. All her instincts are concentrated on the mother in the negative form of resistance and are therefore no use in building her own life. Should she get as far as marrying, either the marriage will use for the sole purpose of escaping her mother, or as a diabolical fate will present her with a husband who shares all the essential traits of her mother. All instinctive processes meet with unexpected difficulties. Sexuality does not function properly, or children are unwanted, or maternal duties seem unbearable, or the demands of marital life are responded to with impatience and irritation. It's quite natural, since none of it has anything to do with the reality of life, when stubborn resistance to the power of the mother in every form has come to be life's dominating aim. In such cases, one can often see the attributes of the mother archetype demonstrated in every detail. For example, mother as representative of the family causes either violent resistance or complete indifference to anything that comes under the head of family, community, society, convention, and the like. Resistance to the mother as uterus manifests as menstrual disturbances, failure of conception, abhorrence of pregnancy, hemorrhages, etc. The mother as materia or mater may be at the back of this woman's impatience with objects, because he says the women might be clumsy in handling tools or clothes or whatever. Again, resistance can sometimes result in spontaneous development of the intellect for the purpose of creating a sphere of interest which the mother has no place. The development springs from the daughter's own needs and not for the sake of a man she would like to impress or dazzle by a semblance of intellectual comradeship. Its real purpose is to break the mother's power by intellectual criticism and superior knowledge. Okay, so we also have a type that is, so we have one that is dominated, wants to be a childbearer, one that doesn't want to bear children, but is more like the fantasy woman, sexually active. We have the one whose entire life is defined by her mother and controlled by it, and therefore becomes very helpless. And then we have the one who is like anything but mother. So those are the four types. And those are all extremes. I mean, I think that those of us in our relationships to our mothers probably have some variation of that. Like I said, I wouldn't say I'm exactly the fourth, but I'm pretty close to it because because I do have a very strong intellectual life that my mother doesn't share in at all and doesn't really understand. And we do have kind of we definitely are at odds in terms of what we value and so forth. I mean, I won't say that we have a bad relationship, but it tends to be more cordial than it is intimate. So, so that is, that's interesting. And also the way that men tend to respond to those types when they project the anima is also an interesting thing. So, okay, I don't want to go on too much longer. That's what I have to say about mother goddesses. I hope you found this interesting and useful, and we'll see you. I'm gonna stop my share right now of my screen. Okay. And with that, I will see you in the next lecture. Enjoy.